Now, I'm tempted this morning to preach from Psalm 30, because that's such a nice psalm. It's a beautiful celebration of healing. You've turned my mourning into dancing. You've taken away my sackcloth and clothed me with joy. It's a beautiful psalm, actually. And it's a psalm that has both it's both the personal acclamation of someone who has experienced God's healing, but it also is a psalm that is eschatological in its meaning. It's a bigger picture of God's ultimate purpose in the world, which is to bring completion and fullness and healing. So it's really quite an astonishing psalm. I'm tempted to do that. However, I'm going to resist that temptation, and I'm going to do something more difficult, which is work together with you in unpacking this morning's gospel. Because there are some problems in this morning's gospel, I think, or at least some challenges that it might be fruitful for us to work with together. There has and always has been, always will be, tension within the communities of Jesus about how to understand Jesus, who Jesus was, what Jesus was like, what he did, what he intended to do, what he meant by what he said and did, obviously, right? We're all aware of this. And there is a tension between, I would say, a kind of idealized version of Jesus, which nobody sets out to create, it just happens. And then there is within the gospel record some very challenging aspects of Jesus that are a little less easy to embrace. This morning's gospel, if you remember, says what about Jesus' reaction to the leper coming to him?
He's incensed.
Incensed. What? Does anybody else have a little bit of a disconnect there? Am I the only one? What's that about? So, a bit of background. As you probably know, there is a whole science of textual criticism with respect to the underlying manuscripts out of which our translations come. The oldest complete manuscript of the New Testament dates to about the 300s. CE of the Common Era. There are older fragments, but that's really the earliest complete manuscripts. And there are variations, often within the manuscripts, this whole family of manuscripts. And there, as I said a moment ago, is a science of textual criticism. And if I had a Greek New Testament here this morning and I opened it to this page, you would see the Greek text at the top of the page. And at the bottom of the page, taking up usually about a third of the page, on every page of the Greek New Testament, you would find what is called a textual apparatus. And in that textual apparatus, you would see identified all the variant readings for each verse and often each word. Now, that's not that big a deal because the variant readings turn out most of the time to be of no real consequence. They don't fundamentally change the meaning of the text. But this morning's text is different. In this morning's text, we have, by the way, if we had read from the book of the Gospels instead of the newer translation which we're reading from this year, if we had just read from the book of the Gospels, which is the New Revised Standard Version, we would have read the translation like this. A leper came and kneeled before Jesus and begging, and Jesus, with pity, with compassion, reached out and touched him. So these are very different ways of understanding the story, aren't they? They completely change the feeling of the story. Now what's interesting, I won't go into all the details, but what's interesting is it's actually the earliest manuscripts. And before the manuscripts, there's fragments of the Gospels that are even earlier than complete manuscripts. And it's these earlier witnesses that have this Greek word anger in them. And it's the later manuscripts in which that word disappears and is replaced with the word for compassion or pity. So scholars go back and forth about, well, what really is the right translation here? Then it's a good faith effort to understand what Mark may have been intending. Generally, now, most of the translations that are being done in the last 20 years or so are tending to say the more difficult reading would be anger, and probably we should wrestle with this more difficult reading. Because it's more likely. Now how many of you would prefer it was pity? Compassion. Come on, raise your hand. I'm with you. And that's one of the exegetical hermeneutic devices that we use. We look at our own biases and we say, oh yeah, I would much prefer or compassion and pity. I really don't want to get close to this angry Jesus. Which should send us a message. Maybe that's our bias. So I'm giving a sort of mini teaching here about hermeneutics and how we approach the Scripture and ways in which we sometimes have to come close to Scripture that make us feel uncomfortable. So I want you to be with me this morning in seeing if we can get close to Jesus' anger. Let's just assume, for our purposes, that we're reading it as anger. And it's a very strong word, by the way. It isn't just Jesus was annoyed. No, he was mad, furious. What is this about? What is he angry about? This is my fundamental question with the text this morning. What is he angry about? And I want to use that as a way for us to wrestle a little bit with our image of who Jesus was and what it means to follow Jesus. So, taking a step back, the context. This is a leper. This is clear from the context. It's clear from everything that happens. This isn't just a rash. This is leprosy, and the reason that's important is that there's an entire Levitical process for cleansing from leprosy. If you read in Leviticus chapter 13 and 14, it's a very elaborate process. And skin diseases, leprosy in general, were understood to be, first of all, communicable. And secondly, they were understood in the purity laws to render one impure. Not only impure, but if you had leprosy, you were excluded from the religious life of Israel. Now, the rabbis in the first century, by at least the first century, had a saying. And the rabbinic saying was, only God can raise the dead and cure a leper. Now, where did that come from? Well, partially it comes from our reading today. There are only 3 places. Yes, 3 places in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Scripture, where there is a healing from leprosy. The first one, interestingly enough, happens in the book of Exodus, when Moses has the interaction with God at the burning bush. I don't know if you remember that story, but God basically says to Moses, I've got a calling for you. I want you to go back to Egypt and set your people free. And that initiates a long negotiation between Moses and God, Moses continually putting up all the reasons why this is not a good idea, why it ought to be someone else. And early on in that conversation, Moses says, how will they know that you've given me this authority? I'll go back and say, God told me, and they'll say, yeah, prove it to us. And it's interesting that in that moment, God says to Moses, according to the text in Exodus, God says to Moses, Moses, put your hand inside your coat. So he does. God says, pull it out. He pulls it out. It's leprous. God says, now put your hand back in. Now pull it out. It's clean. Get the picture, Moses. A second time, leprosy comes up in the Torah. And this is in the book of Numbers. A healing of a leper. And this time, it's a story about Moses and Miriam and Aaron. Now, remember, they're siblings. Moses is the older brother. Moses is the younger brother. Miriam's probably the oldest. It's probably Miriam that helped save Moses years earlier. So there's Miriam, there's Moses, and there's Aaron. Now, for some reason, we're not told why, Aaron and Miriam begin to resent Moses. In fact, they begin to criticize him for his choice of a wife. Ever happen in a family? God says, the three of you come to the tent of meeting, I want to talk to you. So they come to the tent, the tabernacle. And God says, how dare you criticize Moses, my servant? Has there ever been a prophet like Moses? No. He said, and just to show you how unhappy I am, and in that moment, Miriam is covered with leprosy. Now, of course, the story is that Moses, being who Moses is, immediately beseeches and intercedes for Miriam that she be healed. And she is healed. That's the second time in the Hebrew Scriptures there's a healing. The third time was the one we read about this morning. But did you notice, this will come back, what does Elisha do? He doesn't even bother to come out of the house. He doesn't even get close. He sends a servant to the door. They don't even go out the door. He says, hey, yeah, go to the river.
7 times.
You notice how far away they stay. Well, why would they? They understand. They can't get close to a leper. They would become ceremonially unclean. So those are the 3 Old Testament readings from the Hebrew Scriptures with respect to healing from leprosy. It's a very serious thing. Now, leprosy came to be viewed within the religious world in which Jesus lived, not simply as a disease of the skin, but as a reflection of a deeper moral condition. It became something, there were lots of sins, but there was something particularly pernicious about slander. And that's what was associated with, remember the story of Miriam and Aaron, associated with leprosy. So the leper became, in Jesus' religious world, like one dead. Dead, spiritually dead, physically ultimately, if it were truly leprosy. Dead socially, completely cast out, completely outside the scope of the religious social system of Israel. It was a sentence of social religious death. Only God can raise the dead and cure the leper, right?